Welcome to Mystara for a journey back to eastern Skothar due to popular demand, starting at the furthest point east with the Technomancy of Zyxl. This is my own creation. In canon lore, there is absolutely nothing in anything about Zyxl except for the name of the island and the creatures that now live there. Take or leave this video as you see fit. I tried to make it interesting and seeded in past references to other places while keeping with the African vibe that I imagined eastern Skothar to possess. I'm Mr. Welch, and today we're studying the law of unexpected consequences. The rise and fall of Zyxl starts like every great classic Judy Blume's kids novel, with the end of the world. Before the Great Reign of Fire, Blackmoor had effectively conquered the world. In some regions, they only had a marginal presence, but they had colonized space and were well known across the globe as the people in charge of everything. One of these regions was Zyxl, a small island on the other side of the continent of Skothar, and it was little more than a monitoring station. I bet one with several hundred people stationed there. Then somebody in Blackmoor put slot A into tab B, and the other side of the world got uncomfortably hot for everybody else. Zyxl immediately knew something was very wrong when all communications went offline as the blast took out most of the satellites in orbit over Blackmoor. Being a small town loaded with sensors and communications equipment, they saw to their horror as each of the Blackmoor cities in their great empire was wiped off the map or buried in tons of rock and soil falling back to Earth. The debris fell for days, followed by the blackening of the sky and the temperatures plummeting. The outpost of Zyxl, isolated and alone on some small island, was apparently the last remnant of the great Blackmoor empire. In reality, they weren't the last, but the few pockets that were left began to realize the hopelessness of their situation. Many went mad in despair and decided to end it all rather than face slow starvation as their supplies would quickly run out. Others left their posts and went to scavenge for food and supplies, never returning to the ruins of their past. But the scientists and staff in Zyxl were on an island. They had flying technology, but limited power reserves. If something happened to one of their flyers, they couldn't replace it. They refused to despair and decided to use what assets they did have to try to save themselves. Their first step was to ration what food they had. With the onset of the nuclear winter, growing crops was going to be difficult, though it wasn't as severe thanks to Zyxl being shifted near the equator. The growing season was small, but because of the weather monitoring gear present, the scientists made most of what time they had. The outpost wasn't going to starve. Once the scientists solved that problem, the population of Zyxl started going over all their computers and other information sources to help expand the new nation of Zyxl. They found several schematics for new vehicles and buildings, and ways to replicate the energy sources necessary for the island to thrive. More importantly, the computer had a large amount of information on all sorts of biological enhancements and treatments to extend life significantly. The first leader of Zyxl was their lead scientist, who, to his credit, was able to overcome the catastrophic situation the island found itself in. He began to adjust the devices he had to control rather than predict the weather, allowing Zyxl to thrive in the middle of an ice age. He kept up the spirits of the nation's citizens by ordering them back to scientific research. They might be the last bastion of Blackmoor's might, but they were going to carry on the legacy. Eventually, he realized a complication that he had long suspected. There weren't enough people on Zyxl to sustain its population. They would need to find more people or die out in a few generations. Cloning was an option, and one that many utilized. The advanced science of Blackmoor allowed scientists to extend their lifespan into the centuries, but the population base was still too small. They were creating copies of themselves, but not adding any new genetic material. The Zyxlans decided to see what humans were nearby on the mainland and use them for breeding stock, preferably through diplomacy. The scientists sent out an expedition on their flyers filled with food and medicine to use as trade goods. Their first contact was successful beyond their wildest dreams. Like most of the world, the native Tangorans were a scattered and weakened people after the Great Reign of Fire. When a few starving tribes were approached by the well-fed and highly advanced Zyxlans, who offered to take the Tangorans to what sounded like a paradise with no strings attached, there was no arguing. When Zyxl sent out the next group to bring back more Tangorans, this time there were members of the first tribe that volunteered to go with them. This made acquiring more breeding stock even easier. Eventually the Tangorans began to pseudo-worship the Zyxlans as the fair-skinned saviors of the region. Back on Zyxl, the breeding program began, with the Zyxlans educating the Tangorans in their advanced technology and arcane sciences. Soon the streets of Zyxl were filled with children, which caused Zyxl to expand its settlement into an entire city. Every time it was determined that the population needed to expand its genetic base, more Tangorans were required. Within 3 generations, the native Zyxl and Tangoran refugees had merged into a single people. During this time, the nation's focus on magitech research had become paramount, leading them to take up the name they would soon become famous for, the Technomancers of Zyxl. Within 300 years after the Great Reign of Fire, the original Technomancers had died out, replaced by the descendants of mixed blood. They maintained Blackmoor technology, creating things like weapons or replicators by reverse engineering the original designs. Their biggest concern was the power crystals, which used what would become known as the radiance. They had a method to create more power crystals with their reactor, but the process was slow, and they could never produce enough to maintain their previous level of technology. The power crystals were always rationed, so ordinary Blackmoor luxuries like robots or other labor-saving devices weren't available. Over the centuries, the Technomancers began to focus entirely on their arcane and scientific studies. This meant fewer of their numbers were working in the fields or service industries. The citizens brought up this problem to the ruling Council of Elders, who made a troubling decision. They were practically worshipped as immortals on the mainland. Why not bring more for those duties? Again, the plan worked well at first, but the Tangorans brought over found themselves second-class citizens instead of equals, like the original Tangoran immigrants. They were well fed and cared for, but found themselves laboring in the fields or managing mundane tasks like cleaning or running shops. They had no say in their own lives, no upward mobility, and they were little more than serfs. Discontent grew in Zyxl between the Tangorans and the Technomancers over the disparity in rights. At first, the Technomancers thought it would be easy to return the discontented Tangorans to their homeland and just recruit more. But word began to spread in Tangor about the poor treatment in Zyxl, so volunteers were hard to find on the continent. This created a stir as the Council of Elders began discussing new ways to acquire labor, from clones to attempt at building constructs that could do the work, but at the expense of a good amount of Zyxl's resources. But then a solution literally washed up. Zyxl had a small number of Blackmoor-era weapons, and while not enough to wage war, they were more than enough to defend the island. A ship from the Slavers' Bay discovered that the hard way. Zyxl is some distance from the area known as Slavers' Bay, but the ships of that region were being forced to go further down the coast to find unsuspecting towns to raid. The closest settlements had long been their favorite target, but now they were either depopulated or heavily fortified. One raider grew bold and headed to Tangor hundreds of miles away, but due to a storm they found themselves in sight of Zyxl. The slavers saw the port's bright lights, decided it was a ripe target, and sailed right in. A single blast from a Blackmoor weapon turned the ship into splinters. When they finally reached shore, the few survivors found themselves at the mercy of several Technomancers. The Zyxlans discussed what to do with the slavers, as it was standard practice to execute trespassers. The pirates were given translation devices and interrogated, and during this encounter, the first mate, the highest-ranking survivor, overheard that they were being considered for serfs. Then, in a brazen act of chutzpah, he offered an exchange. He could supply Zyxl with as many slaves as they needed in exchange for what trade goods he could get. The Technomancers loaned the surviving crew a small vessel they salvaged from a previous wreck, and sent them back with a time limit to return with slaves to work the fields of Zyxl. It wasn't easy sailing back to the slavers' coast with the bomb collars locked around their neck, but the slavers managed. They presented their superiors with the few trade goods the Technomancers sent in good faith. The slavers rewarded the crew for these magitech devices with a larger ship and a hold full of slaves. The start of Zyxl's corruption was complete. The crew made it back in time with just hours to spare, and the slaves were treated for various maladies before being sent to work in the field for the Technomancers. At first, the slaves just grew crops or worked in menial labor jobs, but after a while, they started to be used for domestic servants like maids or gardeners. Their lives actually improved as slaves under the Technomancers, but they weren't free. They were well-treated beasts of labor in a gilded cage. But the demand for more slaves kept the ships coming, and the Technomancers began relying more on slave labor over the years. Then the misfortune that inadvertently brought about their doom hit. It is no secret that the slavers were no one's friend on Skothar, but they were powerful and they could defend themselves against any force sent by land. But the Ajah tribe came under the leadership of Shata Khan, a warrior king wise beyond his years. After the slavers attacked an Ajah village, Shata Khan ordered their ships to be burned when discovered, and any city that protected them razed to the ground. Other nations joined in with this decree, and while the countries didn't trust each other, they hated the slavers even more. This didn't stop the slave raids, but the attacks significantly reduced their effectiveness. The long distance between the slavers' coast and Zyxl meant ships couldn't make this trip quickly, especially when they risked being burned to the waterline if discovered. But Zyxl still needed slaves. They saved the life-extending magitech for themselves, not wasting it on servants. Most of the best quality magitech was for the Technomancers only. If a slave was seriously injured, they were mercifully euthanized. But the slavers' ships slowly became a trickle, and their supply of slaves eventually was just a few dozen every month or so. When confronted, one of the slaver captains explained the situation and asked for help fighting off the navies of the nations aligned against them. The Technomancers refused. They never shared their weapons or similar technology. But they had an idea. They could use their weapons to gather the slaves themselves. They were loath to get their hands dirty with such a vile task, but they had the magic and technology to get someone else to do it for them. Thus, the Demiurge were planned. The Technomancers sent the slavers at Zyxl to the arm of the Immortals to secure several humanoids for the process. While reluctant, the slavers did as told. Only about half of them returned, but they had several tribes of ogres in their holds. The reward the slavers got for obtaining the ogres was to be used as the initial human stock for the Demiurge project. The Technomancers used their Blackmoor technology to create a fusion of the ogres and the slavers into a new race that had the bulk of an ogre but the intelligence of a human. The project wasn't entirely successful, for the Demi-Org only had some of the size of an ogre and were not as intelligent as the Technomancers had hoped. Several thousand were created using the templates and then unleashed on the mainland to get more slaves from Tangor. The initial assault was brutal. Eastern Skothar is not mineral rich. Iron weapon and armors are luxuries for most nations. The Technomancers had long discovered the method to fabricate objects with their magitech, so every Demi-Org was fully clad in plate armor and carrying large war scythes. The first battle was a slaughter, with the outmatched Tangorians routing in fear of this new threat. Thousands of slaves poured into Zyxl, with the most muscular men being converted into more Demi-Org for the conquest. Before the Tangorian queen could even begin to mount a somewhat effective defense, she'd lost a quarter of her country to the Demi-Org. But again, outsiders would create a setback that would inadvertently spell disaster for the Technomancers. The Aja tribe were expansionists, and started to move against Tangor as part of their season of war. That's where they first encountered the Demi-Org. It was as much of a clash of cultures as it was a test of arms. The Demi-Org won the field that day, but the battle was far from over. The Tangor people were not warlike. The Aja, on the other hand, most certainly were. The Aja adapted to the tactics of the Demi-Org. The Demi-Org relied on their physical size plus superior weapons and armor for victory. The Aja developed methods to negate those advantages. They encircled isolated groups of Demi-Org, lured them into ambushes, and refused to fight on even terms. Eventually, they began to push the Demi-Org back. The Technomancers had no stomach for battle themselves. They blamed defeats solely on the Demi-Org. The commander of their troops pointed out that they needed help from the Technomancers and begged their masters to unleash the superior technology of Zyxl on the Aja. The Technomancers instead created the Demi-Org savants, highly intelligent Demi-Org capable of wielding magic. The introduction of the savants immediately turned the tide of battle. The Aja were surprised by the magical barrage the savants brought to the battlefield. They were driven back as the savants possessed a grasp of tactics that surpassed even veteran generals. The Demi-Org stopped their advance at Tangor's border while regrouping and establishing supply lines. Several savants returned to Zyxl to report on their victories and plan their next strategy. This simple action became the doom of Zyxl. Demi-Org had only known war for their masters. They were created fully grown and were immediately sent from their tanks to the front lines. The savants didn't know what to expect when they returned, but thought they would see Demi-Org thriving in their homeland alongside the Technomancers. They only saw human slaves and Demi-Org guards keeping watch over the chattel. Then one of the savants noticed something missing. There were no female Demi-Org. Not any female Demi-Org they could see, but none of the Demi-Org in Zyxl were female, and certainly not any of the Demi-Org in Tangor. When confronted about this, the Council of Elders coldly said that the Demi-Org were a weapon, and they were not expected to breed, only fight. To make matters worse, the Elder insulted the savants by telling them the race was indeed fertile, but also entirely male. They would be extinct in a generation as planned. Empathy was never a strong point for the Technomancers. They were superior to all other races and nations, being the direct descendants of the last bastion of Blackmoor. They didn't need to trade, the nation was self-sufficient. The only reason they needed slaves was to free up time to focus on their research. That was a fatal flaw. The savants were outraged at the omission of their planned extinction. The Elder didn't inform them of their condition with malice, but like a college professor reading a boring text to disinterested students. Thus the Demi-Org Revolution began. The Council of Elders and the savant generals all but annihilated each other in that chamber. Still, the savants were able to send messages to other Demi-Org, informing them of their disposable nature. Zyxl burned. The Technomancers were not a numerous people. They never were. They were also soft, never having to fight a war or lift a finger to defend themselves. They didn't have to. They had magical weapons that did it for them. But those weapons faced out into the ocean, and the Demi-Org were in their streets and guarding their homes. Their own creations slaughtered their former masters where they could find them, along with any human slaves. To the warriors, all humans were the same. Several Technomancers started using the Blackmoor technology to put down the revolution. The Demi-Org birthing pods were destroyed by a Technomancer in an act of sabotage to prevent them from creating more Demi-Org. The central computer hub burned as the last of the Technomancers died at the hands of their former slaves. In a single day, every Technomancer was dead. The island of Zyxl burned for a week. Few humans survived, and all of them were slaves who were spared by the savants, who saw them as fellow victims of their dead masters. While the savants showed the slaves mercy, they also put all of them on a boat back to Tangor. Zyxl was now the home of the Demi-Org, but the race had numerous problems. They were warriors, not farmers, doctors, or craftsmen. Everything on the island was built for a race almost half their size. Many magic tech devices remained, but even the savants had no idea of their purpose. Worse, they still had no idea how to create Demi-Org females. Using magic spells to change creatures into females was impractical. They needed tens of thousands of females to keep their race viable. They had no friends. To the Tangorans and the Aja, they were savage brutes that only knew war, and that's where they find themselves now. Zyxl is one long adventure hook. Yes, it's filled with all sorts of Blackmoor-era devices, and no, the inhabitants won't share them. The Technomancers were originally a curious and self-sufficient group, but they grew decadent and corrupt over the thousands of years after the Great Rain of Fire. They were masters of their own domain, and were content with that knowledge. But they couldn't use all their great technology if they wanted to. They were merely an outpost that required resupply from Blackmoor. They didn't have all the fantastic magitech Blackmoor possessed at its height. They originally didn't need robots, ray guns, or void ships. They were a weather station. They could create power cells in small numbers, but not enough to enjoy the standard of living Blackmoor had when it blew up. Now Zyxl is almost a ruin. The Demiurge have torn apart and rebuilt most of the buildings that survived the revolution to create homes they could fit in. There are still a lot of magitech just lying around, and the savants have figured out the uses for some of them, but others are a mystery, and a dangerous mystery at that. Remember, Blackmoor devices don't like it when you randomly push buttons. If you're lucky, the smoking crater will only contain you. The Demiurge are a mistrustful but gullible race. They were used as cannon fodder, made the worst possible first impressions on their neighbors, and they're unfamiliar with most races. Not saying you can't make friends with one, just saying you've got your work cut out for you. That's the Technomancers of Zyxl, from their rise to their fall. They started as victims of Blackmoor's hubris, but then became victims of their own. None of this is canon. This is me filling a black hole on the map. But it was a pretty big hole, and it filled in nicely. Next week is a beefy topic. What happens if entropy wins? There's a lot of evil immortals out there, but not all of them have the same idea on how to end the world. But until then, remember, when you dine with the devil, use a long spoon.